Volume 1, Book 5, Chapters 25 to 34 of the Life of Apollonius of Tyana. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of Apollonius of Tyana by Flavius Philostratus, translated by F.C. Conybeare. Volume 1, Book 5, Chapters 25 to 34. Chapter 25. And when he had gone into the temple, he was struck by the orderliness of its arrangements, and thought the reason given for everything thoroughly religious and wisely framed. But as for the blood of bulls and the sacrifices of geese and other animals, he disapproved of them, nor would he consider that they constituted repasts of the gods. And when a priest asked him what induced him not to sacrifice like the rest, "Nay, you," he replied, "should rather answer me what induces you to sacrifice in this way." The priest replied, "And who is so clever that he can make corrections in the affairs of the Egyptians?" "Any one," he answered, "with a little wisdom, if only he comes from India." "And," he added, "I will roast a bull to ashes this very day, and you shall hold communion with us in the smoke it makes, for you cannot complain if you only get the same portion which is thought enough of a repast for the gods." And as his image was being melted in the fire, he said, "Look at the sacrifice." "What sacrifice?" said the Egyptian, "for I do not see anything there." And Apollonius said, "The Lamidae, and the Taliadae, and the Clytiadae, and the oracle of the black-footed ones have talked a lot of nonsense, most excellent priest, when they went on at such length about fire, and pretended to gather so many oracles from it. For as to the fire from pine wood and from cedar, do you think it is really fraught with prophecy and capable of revealing anything, and yet not esteem a fire lit from the richest and purest gum to be much preferable? If then you had really any acquaintance with the lore of fire worship, you would see that many things are revealed in the disk of the sun at the moment of its rising." Chapter 26. With these words he rebuked and silenced the Egyptian, showing that he was ignorant of religion. But because the Alexandrians are devoted to horses, and flock into the race course to see the spectacle, and murder one another in their partisanship, he therefore administered a grave rebuke to them over these matters, and entering the temple, he said, "How long will you persist in meeting your deaths, not in behalf of your families or of your shrines, but because you are determined to pollute the sacred precincts by entering them reeking with gore, and to slaughter one another within the walls?" And Troy, it seems, was ravaged and destroyed by a single horse, which the Achaeans of that day had contrived. But your chariots and horses are yoked to your own despite, and leave you no chance of living in submission to the reins of law. You are being destroyed, therefore, not by the sons of Atreus, nor by the sons of Ajax, but by one another, a thing that the Trojans would not have done even when they were drunk. At Olympia, however, where there are prizes for wrestling and boxing and for the mixed athletic contests, no one is slain in behalf of the athletes, though it were quite excusable if one should show an excess of zeal in the rivalry of human beings like himself. But here I see you rushing at one another with drawn swords and ready to hurl stones, all over a horse race. I would like to call down fire upon such a city as this, where amidst the groans and insulting shouts of the destroyers and the destroyed, the earth runs with blood. Can you not feel reverence for the Nile, the common mixing bowl of Egypt? But why mention the Nile to men whose gauges measure a rising tide of blood rather than of water? And many other rebukes of the same kind he addressed to them, as Damas informs us. Chapter 27. Vespasian was harboring thoughts of seizing the absolute power, and was at this time in the countries bordering upon Egypt. And when he advanced as far as Egypt, people like Dion and Euphrates, of whom I shall have something to say lower down, urged that a welcome should be given to him. For the first aristocrat, by whom the Roman state was organized, was succeeded for the space of 50 years by tyrants so harsh and cruel that not even Claudius, who reigned 13 years in the interval between them, could be regarded as a good ruler; and that, although he was 50 years of age when he succeeded to the throne, an age when a man's judgment is most likely to be sane, and though he had the reputation of being fond of culture of all kinds, nevertheless he too, in spite of his advanced age, committed many youthful follies, and gave up the empire to be devoured, as sheep devour a pasture, by silly women who murdered him, because he was so indolent that though he knew beforehand what was in store for him, he would not be on his guard even against what he foresaw. Apollonius, no less than Euphrates and Dion, rejoiced in the new turn of events. But he did not make vice of them as a theme of his public utterances, because he considered such an argument too much in the style of a rhetor. When the autocrat approached the city, the priests met him before the gates, together with the magistrates of Egypt and the representatives of the different provinces into which Egypt is divided. The philosophers also were present, and all their schools. Apollonius, however, did not put himself forward in this way, but remained conversing in the temple. The autocrat delivered himself of noble and gentle sentiments, and after making a short speech, said, "Is the man of Tyana living here?" "Yes," they replied, "and he has much improved us thereby." "Can he then be induced to give us an interview?" said the emperor, "for I am very much in want of him." "He will meet you," said Dion, "in the temple, for he admitted as much to me when I was on my way here." "Let us go on," said the king, "at once, to offer our prayers to the gods, and to meet so noble a man." This is how the story grew up, that it was during his conduct of the siege of Jerusalem that the idea of making himself emperor suggested itself to him, and that he sent for Apollonius to ask his advice on the point, but that the latter declined to enter a country which its inhabitants polluted both by what they did and by what they suffered, which was the reason why Vespasian came in person to Egypt, as well because he now had possession of the throne as in order to hold with our sage the conversations which I shall relate. Chapter 28. For after he had sacrificed, and before he gave official audiences to the cities, he addressed himself to Apollonius, and as if making prayer, he said to him, "Do you make me king?" And he answered, "I have done so already, for I have already offered a prayer for a king who should be just and noble and temperate, endowed with the wisdom of gray hairs, and the father of legitimate sons. And surely in my prayer I was asking from the gods for none other but thyself." The emperor was delighted with this answer, for the crowd too in the temple shouted their agreement with it. "What then?" said the emperor. "Did you think of the reign of Nero?" And Apollonius answered, "Nero perhaps understood how to tune a lyre, but he disgraced the empire both by letting the strings go too slack and by drawing them too tight." "Then," said the other, "you would like a ruler to observe the mean?" "Not I," said Apollonius, "but God himself, who has deigned equality as consisting in the mean. And these gentlemen here, they too are good advisers in this matter," he added, pointing to Dion and Euphrates, for the latter had not yet quarreled with him. Thereupon the king held up his hand and said, "O Zeus, may I hold sway over wise men, and wise men hold sway over me." And turning himself round towards the Egyptians, he said, "You shall draw as liberally upon me as you do upon the Nile." Chapter 29. The result, then, was that the Egyptians regained their prosperity, for they were already exhausted by the oppressions they suffered. But as he went down from the temple he grasped the hand of Apollonius, and taking him with him into the palace, said, "Perhaps some will think me young and foolish, because I assume the reins of kingship in the 60th year of my life. I will then communicate to you my reasons for doing so, in order that you may justify my actions to others, for I was never the slave of wealth that I know of, even in my youth. And in the matter of the magistracies and the honors and the gift of the Roman sovereign, I bore myself with so much soberness and moderation as to avoid being thought either overbearing or, on the other hand, craven and cowardly. Nor did I cherish any but loyal feelings towards Nero, but inasmuch as he had received the crown, if not in strict accordance with the law, at any rate from the autocrat, I submitted to him for the sake of Claudius, who made me consul and sharer of his counsels. And by Athene I never saw Nero demeaning himself without shedding tears, when I thought of Claudius and contrasted with him the wretch who had inherited the greatest of his possessions. And now when I see that even the disappearance of the scene of Nero has brought no change for the better in the fortunes of humanity, and that the throne has fallen to such dishonor as to be assigned to Vitellius, I boldly advance to take it myself. Firstly, because I wish to endear myself to men and win their esteem, and secondly, because the man I have to contend with is a mere drunkard. For Vitellius uses more ointment in his bath than I do water, and I believe that if you ran a sword into him more ointment would issue from the wound than blood, and his continuous bouts of drinking have made him mad, and one who, were he dying, would be full of apprehension lest the pieces should play him false, is yet hazarding the empire in play. And though he is the slave of mistresses, he nevertheless insults married women, and says that he likes to spice his amours with a little danger. His worst excesses I will not mention, for I would rather not allude to such matters in your presence. May I then never submit tamely while the Romans are ruled by such a man as he. Let me rather ask the gods to guide me so that I may be true to myself. And this, Apollonius, is why I, as it were, make fast my cable to yourself. For they say that you have the amplest insight into the will of the gods, and why I ask you to share with me in my anxieties, and aid me in plans on which rest the safety of sea and land, to the end that, supposing the good will of heaven show itself on my side, I may fulfill my task. But if heaven opposes and favors neither myself nor the Romans, that I may not trouble the gods against their wills. Chapter 30. Apollonius clinched his words with an appeal to heaven. "O Zeus," said he, "of the Capitol, for thou art he whom I know to be the arbiter or the present of issue, do thou preserve thyself for this man, and this man for thyself. For this man who stands before thee is destined to raise afresh unto thee the temple which only yesterday the hands of malefactors set on fire." And on the emperor expressing astonishment at his words, "The facts themselves," he said, "you will reveal. So do thou ask nothing of me, but continue and complete that which thou hast so rightly purposed." Now it happened just then, as a matter of fact, that in Rome Diomitian, the son of Vespasian, was matched with Vitellius in the struggle to gain the empire for his father, and was besieged in the Capitol, with the result that although he escaped the fury of the besiegers, the temple was burnt down. And all this was revealed to Apollonius more quickly than if it had taken place in Egypt. When they had held their conversation, he left the emperor's presence, saying that it was not permitted him by the religion of the Indians to proceed at midday in any way other than the Indians do themselves. At the same time the emperor brightened up, and with fresh enthusiasm, instead of allowing matters to slip through his hands, persevered in his policy, convinced by Apollonius's words that his future was stable and assured to him by heaven. Chapter 31. Next day at dawn Apollonius came to the palace, and asked the guards what the emperor was doing, from whom learning that he had long risen and was engaged in his correspondence, he went off and remarked to Damis, "This man shall be sovereign." About sunrise he returned to find Dion and Euphrates already at the door. In return to whose eager inquiries concerning the interview, he repeated the defense of his policy which he had heard from the emperor, though at the same time he let no word escape him of his own opinions. But on being summoned to enter in advance of them, he said, "O king, Euphrates and Dion, long your acquaintances, are at your door, being highly anxious for your welfare. I pray you, call them in also to join in our conversation, for they are both of them wise men." "I throw my doors open," he replied, "to wise men, but to you I purpose to open my breast as well." Chapter 32. When they had been called in, he continued, "In defense of my plans, I said, gentlemen, what I had to say yesterday to Apollonius, our esteemed friend." "We have heard that defense," said Dion, "and it was most reasonable." "Well, today," he went on, "my dear Dion, let us concert some wise conclusions in support of the counsels adopted by me, of a kind to ensure my general policy being both honorable and salutary to mankind. For I cannot forget how Tiberius was the first to degrade the government into an inhuman and cruel system; of how he was followed by Gaius, who, filled with Bacchic frenzy, dressed in Lydian fashion, won sham fights, and by his disgraceful revels violated all Roman institutions. There followed the worthy Claudius, and I remember that he was so much the thrall of women as to lose all sense of sovereignty, nay, even of self-preservation, for they say he was murdered by them. Nero I hardly need assail, for Apollonius, in brief and terse remarks, has exposed the faults of overindulgence and undue severity, by which he disgraced his reign. Nor did I dwell on the system of Galba, who was slain in the middle of the forum in the act of adopting those strumpet sons of his Otho and Piso. As for Vitellius, we had rather Nero should come to life again than betray the empire to him, the most dissolute of all. Perceiving then, my friends, that the throne has fallen into hatred and contempt, by reason of the tyrants I have enumerated, I would fain have you advise me how best I can restore it, so that it should not remain what it has become, namely, a stumbling block to mankind." Apollonius replied as follows: "There was a first-rate flute player, it is said, who used to send his pupils to much worse artists than himself, that they might learn how not to pipe. As then you, my sovereign, have learned from these your good-for-nothing predecessors how not to rule, let us then now turn our attention to the problem, how a sovereign ought to rule." Chapter 33. While Apollonius spoke, Euphrates concealed the jealousy he already felt of one whose utterances clearly interested the emperor hardly less than those of an oracular shrine interest those who repair to it for guidance. But now at last his feelings overcame him. Raising his voice above its usual pitch, he cried, "We must not flatter men's impulses, nor allow ourselves to be carried away against our better judgment by men of unbridled ambition; but we should rather, if we are enamored of wisdom, recall them to the rhythm of life. Here is a policy about the very expediency of which we should first calmly deliberate, and yet you would have us prescribe a way of executing it before you know if the measures under discussion are desirable. For myself, I quite approve of the deposition of Vitellius, whom I know to be a ruffian drunk, with every sort of profligacy. Nevertheless, although I know you to be a worthy man and of preeminent nobility of character, I deny that you ought to undertake the correction of Vitellius without first establishing an ideal for yourself. I need not instruct you in the excesses chargeable to monarchy as such, for you have yourself described them. But this I would have you recognize, that whereas youth leaping into the tyrant's saddle does but obey its own instincts, for playing the tyrant comes as natural to young men as wine or women, and we cannot reproach a young man merely for making himself a tyrant, unless in pursuit of his role he shows himself a murderer, a ruffian, and a debauchee. On the other hand, when an old man makes himself a tyrant, the first thing we blame in him is that he ever nursed such an ambition. It is no use his showing himself an example of humanity and moderation. For of these qualities we shall give the credit not to himself, but to his age and mature training. And men will believe that he nursed the ambition long before, when he was still a stripling, only that he failed to realize it, and such failures are attributed partly to ill luck, partly to pusillanimity. I mean that he will be thought to have renounced his dream of becoming a tyrant because he distrusted his own star, or that he stood aside and made way for another who entertained the same ambition and whose superior courage he dreaded. As for the count of ill luck, I may dismiss it. But as for that of cowardice, how can you avoid it? How escape the reproach of having been afraid of Nero, the most cowardly and supine of rulers? Look at the revolt against him planned by Vindex. You surely were the man of the hour, its natural leader, and not he. For you had an army at your back, and the forces you were leading against the Jews, would they not have been more suitably employed in chastising Nero? For the Jews have long been in revolt, not only against the Romans, but against humanity, and a race that has made its own a life apart and irreconcilable, that cannot share with the rest of mankind in the pleasures of the table, nor join in their libations or prayers or sacrifices, are separated from ourselves by a greater gulf than divides us from Susa or Bactra or the most distant Indies. What sense then or reason was there in chastising them for revolting from us, whom we had better have never annexed? As for Nero, who would not have prayed with his own hand to slay a man well nigh drunk with human blood, singing as he sat amidst the hecatombs of his victims? I confess that I ever pricked up my ears when any messenger from yonder brought tidings of yourself, and told us how in one battle you had slain 30,000 Jews, and in the next 50,000. In such cases I would take the courier aside and quietly ask him, "But what of the great man? Will he not rise to higher things than this?" Since then you have discovered in Vitellius an image and ape of Nero, and are turning your arms against him. Persist in the policy you have embraced, for it too is a noble one, only let its sequel be noble too. You know how dear to Romans are popular institutions, and how nearly all their conquests were won under a free polity. Put then an end to monarchy, of which you have repeated to us so evil a record, and bestow upon Romans a popular government, and on yourself the glory of inaugurating for them a reign of liberty. Chapter 34. Throughout Euphrates' long speech, Apollonius noticed that Dion shared his sentiments, for he manifested his approval both by gestures and the applause with which he hailed his words. So he asked him if he could not add some remarks of his own to what he had just heard. "By heaven I can," answered Dion, "and I should agree in part and in part disagree with his remarks. For I think I have myself told you that he would have been much better employed deposing Nero than setting Jewry to right. But your contention appears to be that he ought never to have been deposed, on the ground that anyone who composed the disorder of his affairs merely strengthened the fellow against all the victims of his power. I approve, however, of the campaign against Vitellius, for I consider it a greater achievement to prevent a tyranny from ever growing up than to put an end to it when it is established. And while I welcome the idea of a democracy, for though this form of polity is inferior to aristocracy, nevertheless moderate men will prefer it to tyrannies and oligarchies. I fear lest the servility to which these successive tyrannies have reduced the Romans will render any change difficult to effect. I doubt if they are able to comport themselves as free men, or even to lift their eyes to a democracy, any more than people who have been kept in the dark are able to look on sudden blaze of light. I conclude that Vitellius ought to be driven from power, and would fain see this effected as quickly and as well as can be. I think, however, that though you should be prepared for war, yet you yourself, instead of declaring war against him, ought rather to threaten him with condign punishment, in case he refuses to abdicate. And in case you capture him, as I believe you will easily do, then I would fain see you give the people of Rome the right to choose their own polity, and if they choose a democracy, allow it them. For this will bring you greater glory than many tyrannies and many victories at Olympia. Your name will be inscribed all over the city, and brazen statues will be erected everywhere, and you will furnish us with a theme for harangues in which neither Harmodius nor Aristogeiton will bear comparison with you. If, however, they accept monarchy, to whom can they all possibly decree the throne except yourself? For what you already possess and are about to resign into the hands of the public, they will surely rather confer on yourself than on another." This is the end of chapters 25 through 34 of Volume 1, Book 5 of the Life of Apollonius of Tyana, read by Mary Schneider.